Africa's 1.2 billion people, its natural resources, and other factors have positioned the continent for meaningful economic growth in the coming years. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or CFTA, would expand trade and remove oppressive tariffs and other barriers that hinder prosperity in the region. In the first in a series of Jones Day Talks Africa programs, partner Javed Chaudhry discusses the CFTA and also explains what companies considering investment or expansion in Africa should know right now. I'm Dave Dalton. You're listening to Jones Day Talks Africa. Javed Chaudhry is a partner in Jones Day's global disputes practice. He advises companies on domestic and international mergers, acquisitions, and strategic alliances, as well as corporate governance, compliance, and internal investigations. Javed is the partner in charge of the firm's Middle East and Africa region. Javed, thanks for being here today.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Let's talk about the African economy from a very broad perspective, high-level view. What's the economy there on the continent like today?
The economy of Africa really reflects its colonial history. Many of the countries of Africa have received their independence and at least attempted to become independent economies that rely not just on their old colonial masters, but more. And if you think back, for example, to East Africa, independence did not come until approximately the 60s. Mm-hmm. And that reflects the economy. Most of the trade of each individual country was with its old colonial master. Very little trade took place between African countries. Obviously, the reason for that, in part, was because there wasn't the transportation, infrastructure, and other factors that usually allow intercompany trade, as, for example, we have between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Mm-hmm. And this is actually the reason why this African Continental Free Trade Agreement is such an exciting development, because I think it holds out the promise to alter that paradigm over several years, mind you, not overnight.
Let's talk about the potential for a second, and we'll get to CFTA in a second. Because of the way the trade and the economic patterns have developed, I guess maybe economic growth has been stifled. Is that correct?
I think that's right. If you think about it this way, which is that if you have markets next door, then the economies of scale work. Mm-hmm. It makes sense to set up a factory or set up some kind of production facility because whatever it is, whether it's a mineral or an agricultural product, or it's a widget or some food materials that you produce, if you know that you can market it throughout at least the neighboring countries, the investments make sense. But that has not been the case. Between the limitations of infrastructure and in some cases tariff considerations, that is just not the history of Africa.
So people have just basically, because of the current situation, they've given up. They don't even try and trade with neighboring countries usually.
I'd like to hope they try, but the difficulties are many. And, in my own observations over the years, including when I grew up in Nairobi, Kenya, this was very self-evident. We were much more likely to see the products of countries across oceans, Europe, for example, right, than you would to see products made in an adjacent country.
Wow, lots of potential, I would imagine. All right, let's put a point on this. You mentioned tariffs. You said infrastructure issues. Any other problems that have sort of, undermined free trade between the nations on that continent?
Those are the main ones. There are others. Unfortunately, those are the larger issues of many developing countries around the world. It's the lack of an overall rule of law. It's consistent laws and regulations, consistent standards that would apply so that when you're buying certain things that a particular metric works or a particular safety standard works equally whether you are in country A or B. The other problem is, especially this is true when you're crossing national boundaries in Africa, this is just a regrettable fact of life that there is a certain amount of corruption that has historically been associated with those kinds of border crossings. And as you can imagine, Dave, that leads to inefficiencies or outright limitations on the transfer of goods and services across national boundaries.
And certainly would scare off investors and new producers and people who want to try and leverage what could be some strengths there on the continent. I would think. I mean, we look at the natural resources and the coastlines and everything else. The potential there is probably staggering. So a little frustrating, I guess, that this hasn't moved along a little quicker, isn't it?
I think that's very well put, Dave. If you think about the population of the continent of Africa, it's soon going to be about one in every 4 to 5 people. By the half a century from now, it may be 1 out of 4 people in the world.
Wow.
On the continent of Africa. And yet, if you look at the economic numbers, the collective economies of Africa represent a much smaller percentage. Again, if you look at kind of how trade has worked there, the hallmark of Africa is that a lot of commodities produced there, whether it's oil and gas, it's coffee beans, it's tea, it seems that most of those things get processed off the continent. So a large chunk of the value chain of products is not realized on the continent itself. This is obviously not a good thing for the people of Africa. It's also not an efficient economic model. And I think you raised a very good point, which I should touch on. Sometimes you obviously need technology, know-how, and management skills to cause that value chain to be more in that home country than someplace far away. But that needs investment, and that needs certain people to come in, make that investment, bring that know-how, that technology along. But if in fact you have these market dysfunctions, which have historically been true on the continent, that investment is less likely to be forthcoming.
Absolutely. And I would think good investors and smart investors would be lining up if some of these barriers and issues were taken care of, which kind of segues nicely in the next part of our conversation. Talk about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Give us a little history. Where and when did it originate, and who were some of the early proponents of CFTA, as it's called?
Well, it's been going on for a while, and I would say that some of the more advanced economies, if that's the way to say it, of Eastern Africa and Western Africa have been some of the main proponents. As you may know, the place where it eventually got signed was in Rwanda, which is obviously not on the coast itself, but in Eastern Africa. Mm-hmm. And actually, the idea has been kicking around for quite a while, but the objective was exactly what we are talking about, to try to create an Africa-wide economic situation where some of these tariffs, some of the barriers are done away with, and the ability to have trade across national boundaries is simplified dramatically. That's the objective. I hasten to add that I do not think it will happen overnight. It will take probably 2 decades.
At least there's some progress, I would think. So how would this play out? The agreement's been ratified, I suppose.
No, it hasn't. It's been signed.
Signed. Okay, please explain the difference.
So this is a long process, and again, if you think of it this way, the end goal is a single continental market where there is free movement of not only goods, but services, investments, and so forth. So there are many different pieces to it. 49 countries signed this agreement. It's going to take 22 countries ratifying it before it goes into effect, just like treaties normally work.
Sure.
There were many expectations that we would get to that number even by the end of this year. I think we are more likely to see that number being reached sometime in the first half of next year. I hope faster, but I wouldn't hold my breath. But sure. Once it's ratified, things start to incrementally come into place. Some benefits will be evident pretty quickly. Others will take a while. For example, the actual instrument that was signed recently, the formal document, it had a whole bunch of, again, like treaties normally tend to do, protocols, annexes, appendices, and guidelines. Each of those are instruments that speak to some of these other things that I've mentioned. Okay. And so those things have still to be negotiated. Some of the things have started, but others are still in a very early stage. So, for example, tariff reductions, issues around rules of origin, trade and services, and importantly, dispute resolution modalities, those are all still, in their infancy in terms of negotiation, let alone execution or ratification. So this is the beginning of a journey,
Right.
but the good news is the journey has started.
At least they're talking, right?
Yep.
Talk about how the changes proposed would impact companies not based in Africa, but perhaps are considering greater business involvement there, manufacturing, investment. Obvious example. How would this affect a U.S. company perhaps considering investment on the continent?
So the one thing to think about, obviously, the original objective of this thing is to create a pan-African free market. And I think just as you alluded to at the beginning of our discussion, companies coming in to invest are less likely to invest if they see lots of tariff and non-tariff barriers, because they know that whatever investment they make, fruits are not going to be fully realized because they are not going to be able to take advantage of broad swaths of geography. Mm-hmm. That hopefully, with this new Continental Free Trade Agreement, will change. And so there's going to be more of an inclination to invest. I should pause here to make this point, which is that there have been existing, sometimes they've kind of fallen out of use, regional compacts. For example, historically, you had the East African Community, you have something out in West Africa, mm-hmm. and there have been regional compacts which have worked. Sometimes they, as I say, they fall into disuse, or the political changes cause them to kind of go away. But it's very likely that certain regional arrangements, like in East Africa or in West Africa, will begin to create at least regional situations where there is less in the way of tariff, less in the way of non-tariff barriers, easier flow of products and goods across national boundaries. So if I were a US company, or for that matter, a European company, I would, consistent with looking at other things like whether your product has a market in that particular environment, I would focus initially on those regions. And that's what, many companies have done. If you look at where US or European companies are currently invested in the continent of Africa, they tend to be in those regions.
Okay, so there's some good news. So there are pockets on the continent where there are arrangements in place where free flow of goods and logistics are decent and the tariffs aren't too heavy and so forth. That's good. So there is a way to access some of the opportunity there. The other reason that's good news, I think, is that there's a template, right? And we've seen this can work. I mean, there are other trade agreements there, maybe not continent-wide, but at least some nations are trying, and with some degree of success.
I think that's quite right. And, certainly East Africa is a good example. There are setbacks from time to time because of temporary, sometimes somewhat more permanent political situations. But basically, yes, there are templates, and those have worked. I think one other factor to mention, which is going to create interesting situations in Africa in the years to come. Not long ago, the only investors you saw on the continent of Africa were the old colonial powers, mm-hmm. Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, but largely the British and the French, because those were the two countries that had most of the continent of Africa as colonies.
Right.
As I mentioned, and that meant they dominated the trade. They also dominated all kinds of other things, including cultural life.
Culture, language, sure, a lot of things, right?
Language, not least, of course. Mm-hmm. But that is changing. And one of the things that we all know that has caused a great deal of change is the arrival of Chinese investors and Chinese state-owned enterprises. And so if you look at the Africa of today, even from just a decade ago, if you go through, for example, an airport like Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, you will now see a large number of Chinese contractors, employees, people who are working on the continent of Africa on infrastructure projects, on various other kinds of investments. And the reason the Chinese have been able to enter the market as quickly as they have, one would argue, is that the government in China has offered up large loans, often interest-free, mm-hmm. in return for signing up with Chinese construction companies, Chinese technology, etc. And so the ultimate object of the Chinese government is to lock up large amounts of resources that exist on the continent of Africa.
I see.
And so the absence in some ways of, for example, some of the traditional American companies in these areas means that there's a vacuum there which has been occupied by Chinese companies. And this has all happened in a matter of about a decade, I would say.
Wow. Well, you know what they say, ignore China at your peril, right? And they're not there because they don't think it's going to work out. Obviously, they see magnificent potential there, I would think.
I think so. And I think the interesting part for me as I've watched the continent change is, and you know, not to make a political statement about it, but I think that some of the colonial powers, for example, the British, they tended to bring some of their institutions with them, technology transfer. That was sort of the ethic. I think with the Chinese, it's a very different model. I'm not, as I said, I'm not necessarily making a political or other statement, but for example, the big Chinese contractors that come, the money comes from China. Most of it is spent on those contractors who have come to do the work. In fact, it doesn't even, in most cases, touch the shores of the continent. The money transfers take place in the home country, meaning in this case, China. And the people who come to work, they often just set up camps and they don't necessarily interact with the local population. So there isn't the kind of cultural interaction that existed with the old colonial powers from Europe. And there isn't the same transfer of management skills or technology. It's really largely a case of undertaking a project, an infrastructure project, a refinery, a port, whatever it might be, a railroad. So it's sort of a different paradigm, and I think one could argue that it doesn't create the same kinds of long-term sustainable technology transfers, management skills that ideally one would like to see if you are a person on the continent of Africa.
What could be done to encourage people to stay?
I think it's really a case of, and we have occasion to advise various clients on this subject, regardless of who we are representing. But I think the most sustainable projects, in my experience, having now done this for over 35 years, is projects where there is a fair sharing of the benefits and burdens. There is meaningful transfer of technology, meaningful transfer of skills, because for one thing, that creates sustainable local populations, which then become marketplaces for products. I think the other thing is that if any project is not properly balanced, sooner or later, there are difficulties and differences between, you know, in my example, let's say an African state-owned enterprise and a foreign contractor. And if that happens, things usually fall apart. You know, projects don't get finished, or they don't get finished properly, or they don't get finished on time. And at the end of the day, the value that one would hope to get is not obtained by either side, with a lot of ill will that follows it. And, you know, unfortunately, we see these situations with a lot of large resource projects. You know, in extreme cases, as we know historically, that leads to nationalization of projects. In other cases, it just results in great inefficiencies.
Inefficiencies, and as you said, hard feelings, and you have bad experiences out there, and that can scare the next investor or the next group off, sadly.
Indeed.
Let's talk about CFTA a second, specifically. As we talk about this sounds to me, to probably anybody listening to this program, this is a good idea, and a lot of people would benefit from this. Literally billions, maybe, ultimately. What's the holdup? Is there organized opposition? You said it could be a couple decades, and that's understandable. I know you don't turn a ship around, you know, that quickly and so forth. But why aren't people more eager? I mean, almost universally, why isn't there a lot of enthusiasm for this, do you think?
Dave, one of the interesting facts of Africa is, first of all, as you know, it's a very large continent, 54 countries, 1.2 billion people. And the cultural differences between a Morocco and a Democratic Republic of Congo versus, you can go down that list, obviously, are great. And it took us a while even to negotiate here in North America, NAFTA, which obviously has now been amended. And as you look at what one would think would be logical pan-North America trade agreements, they haven't come about. They haven't come about for many reasons, including people protecting certain domestic markets,
Mm-hmm.
it's cultural issues, it's geographical issues, and obviously above all, it's economic issues. And I think the problem in Africa is that there is a great diversity of levels of development. And I think that for some countries, and you could just throw a dart at any one of the countries, almost any part of Africa, there are great disparities in terms of the level of economic development and understanding of the benefits of something like this free trade agreement. So anytime you are attempting to affect a change, which is going to mean that at least in the short term, certain domestic producers of widgets, whatever they might be, are maybe disadvantaged, there's a great reluctance to agree to that change, which is why this trade agreement, not unlike trade agreements in other parts of the world, has taken a while. But I think that at least the more visionary leaders on the continent appreciate that the benefits in the medium term will be great and to the benefit of everybody, just like any free trade arrangement is, as in my judgment, NAFTA always has been. So as we begin to have these various pieces that I described, tariffs and services and border measures and so forth, all those start to improve. It will improve the lot of all of the people who are the beneficiaries of this trade agreement. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I think it starts with the various regions. I think, West Africa, however you define it, will come together. That central part of Africa, the Francophone African countries, I think there are some logical ways in which they will initially open up, at least to that region. East Africa is already well along, likewise parts of South Africa. But eventually what has to happen, and I hope this trade agreement will lead to that, is that it will become one integrated market in which, from the perspective of, for example, a US company, it makes sense to come and set up shop in a Kenya or a Ghana and then use that as the hub from where to market to a large number of countries in the vicinity, because the infrastructure will have improved, the transportation will have improved, but importantly, there will not be the tariff or non-tariff barriers that prevent this from happening today. To give you an example, if your truck of whatever it is, whether it's perishables or non-perishables, has to sit at a border post for endless hours and sometimes days, that is not the making of an efficient flow of trade.
I think obviously the fact that the conversations have started, the countries are talking, and hopefully this is well on its way. Javed, this has been more than interesting. I'm fascinated. This is a great topic. Let's talk again soon. It doesn't have to be just about CFTA, but about Africa in general, what Jones Day is doing there, where you see some trends long term, and we'd love to hear more very soon if we could do that.
Well, I hope so. Let me make one point, which is oftentimes, which I think is very important to Jones Day clients and to US and other companies around the world. One aspect of Africa which has personally frustrated me is that people don't appreciate the opportunities there. You have an amazing baseline of commodities. You have this growing population. You have increasingly pockets of very well-educated and underemployed people. So whether that is a market for you or a place where you can do production of various things, there are many opportunities to be had. And I think one thing that all companies, whatever your business, whatever your trade is to keep a closer watch on Africa. I'll give you one example. I was recently very pleasantly surprised to discover a group of people writing apps in East Africa. I would never have expected that.
Me neither.
And yet it's going on there. So if you think about how sometimes unusually interesting business ideas get created in the most unlikely places, Africa should be on your list, whether you are an infrastructure player or in the high-tech space. And so I hope as we go forward here, companies around the world will really pay attention to what's happening in Africa, see as these tariff and non-tariff barriers come down, that there is great opportunity there. And, in the long run, it will help all of us, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very high ceiling, lots of potential. It's going to be fun and fascinating to watch this play out, I think, over the next several years. Javed, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, I enjoyed this, Dave.
You can find Javed's complete biography, along with information on the firm's global disputes practice and its work in Africa at jonesday.com. Subscribe to Jones Day Talks on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Stitcher, and don't forget to check out some of our previous programs while you're there. There's a lot of great information there from dozens of Jones Day lawyers. Thanks for listening to Jones Day Talks Africa. I'm Dave Dalton. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to Jones Day Talks. Comments heard on Jones Day Talks should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. The opinions expressed on Jones Day Talks are those of lawyers appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information, please visit jonesday.com.